Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. We are about to get started. We're going to give those persons that are in the hallway a minute or two to take their seats so that we can get started. Okay, good afternoon once again, distinguished colleagues. Welcome back from what was a very hearty and scrumptious lunch. I heard one of our colleagues say that she's not had a bad meal since she's come to the Bahamas, and of course, that's one of the things we are most proud of. But with this being a session that immediately follows lunch, we want to get started. We intend to be as lively and provocative as we can be, considering that great lunch we all had. And of course, take the opportunity, have the time to take the opportunity to open the floor. So with that being said, I want us to get started. It is, of course, an honor to moderate today's session on the separation of powers and independent parliament. And we've already alluded to this so many times today, even in our first session, so I look forward to this being a very enlightening session indeed. When we think of separation of powers, many of us probably remember studying it in our textbooks as the executive, the legislative, the judiciary. But today we get to move beyond that theory and talk about what it really means in practice for our people, for our parliaments, and of course the doctrine of separation of powers has long been a cornerstone of democratic governance. It's the safeguard that ensures no single branch of government wields unchecked authority, and that Parliament, as the voice of the people, can fulfill its role independently. In the Commonwealth tradition, parliamentarians are not merely legislative people, and parliaments are not just legislative bodies, but we are guardians of the accountability, oversight, and transparency that is critical. Yet the effectiveness of our institutions often hinges on how well we preserve their independence in practice while still maintaining the balance necessary for effective governance. Today, our dialogue will explore how Commonwealth legislators can assert their independence while working constructively with the executive and judiciary, and what lessons we can draw from both historical precedent and contemporary challenges. I am the Honorable Pia Glover Roll, Member of Parliament for Golden Gates, the Minister of Labor and Public Service for the Bahamas. And I would like to introduce my distinguished panel. To my right, two very distinguished gentlemen, and I'll start with the one I know personally, who is to my immediate right, who is our current Minister of National Insurance and Immigration, the Honorable Alfred Sayers, who is a prominent Bahamian politician. He has assumed the position of Immigration and National Insurance Minister since September of 2023, but his parliamentary career dates further back. He is the Member of Parliament for Fort Charlotte, having reclaimed that seat just in 2021 after previously serving from 2000 to 2012. Minister Sayers has served as the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs for the Bahamas from 2002 to 2006, the Minister of Education, Science and Technology from 2002 to 2007, and the Minister of Public Works and Utilities from 2021 to 2023, prior to assuming his current role as the Immigration and National Insurance Minister. He is a distinguished scholar, an attorney who holds multiple degrees. He has exemplary academic and institutional leadership prior to his political career, where he served as an educator, and is known for many philanthropic, community, and regional contributions. On a personal note, Honorable Alfred Sayers is married to Marian Bethel, and ladies, on our session on Saturday when we spoke about, Senator Arisia spoke about womanish ways. Minister Sayers' wife is Marian Bethel, who is in fact the producer of Womanish Ways that we were able to reflect on Saturday. She too is a distinguished lawyer and a poet, and together they have 3 beautiful children. Thank you, Honorable Sayers, for joining us today on this panel. And I will go straight into the introduction of our second panelist, who is the Honorable Speaker of the Cayman Islands. He is the Honorable Ezard Miller, first elected to the Cayman Islands Legislative Assembly, now Parliament of the Cayman Islands, in 1984. He served as the elected member for the constituency of Northside, and in 1988, Honorable Miller was the Minister of Health and Social Services and remained the representative for Northside until 1992. Thereafter, he was employed as a human resource manager for Deloitte Cayman, a company who focuses on audit, tax, financial advisory, enterprise risk services, disaster recovery, IT, and consulting services. In July of 2007, he opened a healthcare consultancy firm, and in May 2009, he was re-elected as the Northside Independent Representative and became a member of the Legislative Assembly, now Parliament, until 2021. He was the leader of the opposition and the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee from 2017 until 2021. And now Honorable Miller is currently serving as the Speaker of the Parliament of the Cayman Islands after being sworn in on the 6th of May 2025 as the 3rd Speaker who was not an elected member. Colleagues, please give our panelists a warm round of applause. I would like to introduce our session today with some guiding questions and then allow our panelists to present. Question 1 speaks to institutional safeguards. A truly independent parliament doesn't mean working in isolation. It must function alongside the executive and the judiciary, but without being overshadowed. So my first line of questioning, or our first guiding question, speaks to what safeguards or mechanisms best ensure that Parliament maintains its independence while still enabling effective collaboration across the branches of government. We will also explore contemporary pressures, which brings us to a more modern-day challenge. In today's world, we see rising polarization, public mistrust of institutions, and new global pressures. So we ask, how can parliaments strengthen their role as independent and credible voices of accountability under these conditions? And finally, we look at reform and innovation, which is a forward-looking approach. Across the Commonwealth, there are examples of reform and innovation in parliamentary practice. We want to investigate the approaches that have proven most effective in reinforcing the separation of powers, and how might they be adapted or shared amongst member states. I now welcome our panelists to help us through those guiding questions and as we explore the topic of separation of powers. Honorable Alfred Sayers.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, my dear colleague, Minister, for such a generous introduction and framing the discussion so succinctly. My respect to the Honorable Speaker, Honorable Ezra Miller. It's a pleasure to share the panel with you. And to my distinguished sister and brethren parliamentarian from our region and the delegates who are attending this conference. As I begin, I had to make the observation that the organization of which we are a part was founded in 1911. It did not escape me that in 1911, the Bahamas was a British colony. It boasted an assembly that met for the first time on the 29th of September, 1729. However, in 1911, most of the residents of the Bahamas, the overwhelming majority of African Bahamians, did not have the right to vote in parliamentary elections, which at that time was restricted primarily to the white merchant minority who enjoyed plural voting based on the number of property they own and the number of companies they own. Secret ballot was only introduced in the Bahamas in 1949. And women did not get the right to vote in the Bahamas until 1961. Therefore, the parliament of which we have the privilege to sit, and certainly my ancestors had to fight for this right. The 1964 Constitution conferred self-government, reconstituted the bicameral legislature into an upper house and lower house, that is the Senate and House of Assembly, vested executive control in a cabinet under the Premier. And according to Gordon Lewis in his book, The Growth of the Modern West Indies, he says, this conferment of self-government and grant to women of the right to vote under the 1964 Constitution, and I quote, left untouched a gerrymandered electoral constituency system which in 1962 permitted the conservative United Bahamian Party to gain 19 seats on the basis of some 26,000 votes, and the Progressive Liberal Party only 8 seats on the basis of 36,000 votes. I'm old enough to have grown up in a colonial Bahamas. According to Sir Lyndon Pindling, in a paper entitled Refining the Revolution, highlighted the Bahamian struggle for democratic governance and majority rule. Sir Lyndon identified the following triggers which culminated in majority rule. The Burma Road riots of 1942, where Bahamian, our uncles and grandparents working on the airfield in Oaksfield were paid half of what white Americans were being paid during the same work. And they put down their tools and went to Bay Street, and we're on Bay Street. And as they march, they said, "I is man." And they confronted the merchant power structure of Bay Street. What a day that was. The Citizen Committee in 1949, the formation of the Progressive Liberal Party in 1953, the anti-discrimination resolution raised in the House of Assembly in 1956, because people looking like us were not allowed to live and be accommodated in this very same hotel, the British Colonial Hotel. The granting of the right to vote to women in 1961, the passage of the Trade Union and Industrial Conciliation Act legalizing collective bargaining, and the dispute over the constituency boundaries in April 1965, where Sir Lyndon and Milo Butler, two of our nationalist leaders, took the mace and threw it out of the window of the House of Assembly. And in fact, what led to that was the solitary woman sitting in as a president of the women's branch of the Progressive Liberal Party, the only woman in the room. The men wanted to boycott Parliament in protest, and she told them, "If you boycott Parliament, I will never support you. We must do something dramatic to open the eyes of the people," which led to what we call Black Tuesday, when the mace, the symbol of authority of the Speaker, was thrown through the window of the House of Assembly. These events, according to Sir Lyndon, made majority rule possible in 1967 and independence in 1973. In 1973, the Bahamas Constitution, an appendix to the Bahamas Independence Order, which was an act of the British Parliament, established the Bahamas as an independent sovereign nation. The representatives of the people at that conference were all men, not one woman in the delegation. These men are known to us: His Excellency Arthur Foulkes, Orville Turnquest, Sir Lyndon, Clement Maynard, A.D. Hanna, Paul Adderley, Philip Bethel, George Smith, Loftus Roker, the late Venerable Cardwell and Brister, Norman Solomon, Milo Butler, Kendall Isaacs, and Carlton Francis and Henry Bowen. Not one woman in the room. I will come to that. further down in my presentation. The form and structure of the Constitution of the Bahamas was patterned after that of Jamaica from 1962, and Jamaica itself was patterned after the Nigerian Constitution of 1960. So we all, through these negotiated contracts, receive similar constitutions which are known as Westminster form of constitutional arrangement. And in this constitutional arrangement, the state is structured with three branches of government: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. In the question of separation of power, I want to refer to a case. It's called Hines and the Queen, because in that case, the Privy Council recognized and elaborated on the theory of the separation of power. That is a theory that a structure is designed to avoid authoritarianism, where one set of people control all of the power of the state. And for us, that was a concrete concern, because the white merchants who ruled this country, they ran the government as an extension of their personal enterprises. The executive, and they controlled the legislature, and our nationalist leaders were often picked up physically and thrown out of the House of Assembly for challenging their mercantilist practice. Stafford Sands, as the Minister of Finance, sat on the board of the Royal Bank of Canada. In other words, they made no separation between their commercial activities and their fiduciary responsibility to the citizens, to the subjects, to the people of the country. In this case, Lord Diplock explains, and I will only read one or two selections from the case. And he said, the peoples for whom new constitutions were being provided were already living under a system of public law and local institutions through which government was carried on. The legislature, executive, and courts reflected the same concept. The new constitutions, particularly in the case of unitary states, were evolutionary, not revolutionary. They provided for continuity of government through successor institutions, legislative, executive, judicial, of which members were to be selected in different ways, but each institution was to exercise powers which, although enlarged, remain of a similar character to those that corresponding institutions that had replaced. And then it goes on, it is well-established rule of construction applicable to constitutional instruments under which government structure is adopted, that the absence of express words to that effect does not prevent legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the new state being exercised exclusively by the legislature, by the executive, and by the judicature, respectively. And we know that in this case, it came out of a gun court that had been established in Jamaica, where the judges of the gun court were appointed differently than judges under the Supreme Court. And the Privy Council held with respect to that gun court that it was unconstitutional, because the constitutional courts of our country, you have security of tenure, and you also have other indicia of independence, which that court did not have. Our Parliament is charged with two basic functions, what I call essential constitutional functions. That is, under our Constitution, Article 52, subsection 1, to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of the Bahamas. Secondly, and this is under Article 72(1), shall have the general direction, that is, the Cabinet shall have the general direction and control of the government of the Bahamas, and shall be collectively responsible, therefore, to Parliament, to make laws for the peace order of the government and the people, but also to be the agency of the state to which the executive is responsible. These two functions require independence. And while the executive has the benefit of holding the purse strings of the state, the Treasury, and the Ministry of Finance, it is nevertheless to be accountable to the Parliament, to the legislature. In carrying out these functions, there's also a third consideration, because the grant of the power to make laws for the peace and good order of the government, there's also says subject to the Constitution. And as parliamentarians, we have to always remember that our function is subject to the supreme law of the land. And the reason why this is important is because in Parliament, we have a privilege. And this privilege exempts us from defamation, but it is not an absolute privilege, because even we, as parliamentarians, we are subject to the Constitution. And this was brought out in a case that also came from the Bahamas and went to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, the Methodist Church. And in the Methodist Church, the Privy Council looked at the relationship between the courts and the Parliament. That is, deference, not to interfere in the internal affairs of the Parliament. But the courts are also the guardians of the Constitution. And in the Methodist case, the Privy Council recognized if an exceptional case shall arise, the need to give full effect to the Constitution may require the courts to intervene in Parliament during the stage of a bill. Before a bill is enacted, in such a case, parliamentary privilege must yield to the court's duty to give the Constitution the overriding primacy which is due. In a case, also from the Bahamas, two of our parliamentary colleagues, in the course of a debate, quoted from the private email of an NGO. And the matter went, a constitutional action was taken, an injunction sought for the emails not to be distributed any further. And the matter came before our Supreme Court, and Madam Justice Indra Charles, as she was then, of our Supreme Court, now a Court of Appeal Justice, this is what she had to say. As a general rule, the court should not meddle in the internal affairs of Parliament and should leave it to regulate its own internal affairs. The court also recognizes that the authority and dignity of Parliament would be seriously compromised if it were to interfere arbitrarily in the internal procedure of Parliament. But if a person alleges that his or her constitutional rights have been or being infringed, in order to establish that infringement, the court would be entitled to carry out an inquiry to determine whether there was indeed a breach. So even our privilege is subject to the Constitution, and we ought to exercise our parliamentary freedom of speech in a manner that pays due deference to the Constitution and the constitutional rights of persons within our country. I would like to adopt, as I give some recommendations, what the evolution of Parliament is or should be. Parliament is part of a constitutional arrangement, and I like how an American scholar describes the Constitution of which the legislature is a part. Maris McDougall says that a constitution must be a living document, a living instrument, a dynamic and continuing process of communication, practices, and decisions. It is made and continually remade in response to the changing demands and expectations of the people under changing conditions. It should reflect not only the shared expectations of the original framers, but also those of succeeding generations. It should also reflect the contemporary shared expectations and experiences of community members today. And that living document is what I would like to apply to our respective parliaments. And that is that when this organization was formed, most of us, our parents and grandparents, didn't have the right to vote. But they fought, and our parliament, under our independent constitution, represents, yes, a negotiation with the British, but it also represents the culmination of demand. In the rest of the region, we know of the general strike in 1937 in Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and throughout our CARICOM member countries, which led to the Moyne Report and constitutional as well as industrial relations development. Parliament, the first recommendation is Parliament must be autonomous and control and have security of tenure for its staff and clerk. And you know, let's be real. We have a tradition where the executive have control the machinery of Parliament. And in the Bahamas, we struggle against that. In fact, it was our administration, under our administration, that the Parliamentary Service Act of 2023 was passed, a significant step to enable the Senate and House of Assembly to impartially and efficiently perform their constitutional functions, duties and obligations, and exercise the powers, transfer the supervision previously exercised by the Cabinet Secretary to the Parliamentary Service Commission under the supervision of the clerk, whose officers and staff by this act are independent, apolitical, and nonpartisan. Furthermore, the act imposes an obligation on the members of Parliament that the members of Parliament shall respect the nonpartisanship and the independence of the staff of the House of Assembly, of the Senate, and the clerk. There was also, I'd like to point out that in 2013, the report of the Constitutional Commission in reviewing the Bahamas Constitution recommended that the office of the Clerk to Parliament and Deputy Clerk with responsibility for the Senate should be established by the Constitution as public officers. And that is the next step I would recommend needs to be taken to further entrench the independence and autonomy of the staff of the legislature by giving them constitutional security of tenure, the same way we do for judges in our judiciary and some of the various commissions within our country. The second recommendation is that Parliament is weakened by a history of patriarchy. And that patriarchy was reflected in our constitutional conference, where not one Bahamian mother, daughter, sat at the table with the British. And we have seen in our development from 1973 to the present that our population is predominantly female. Among our population, the fastest achieving demographic of our population are the women. But when we look at the House of Assembly, which should mirror the country in which it is located, we see an absence of fair representation of women in our parliament, in our cabinet, and it must affect the quality of governance within a country when the best prepared, the most ambitious, the ones who are sustaining the family and the businesses within the country. And I could tell you as a member of parliament, and I've been elected 3 times, right? And I can tell you that I stand before you today as a member of parliament because of the women in Fort Charlotte who started with me in 2000, and they're still with me today. I would not be here because they are consistent. They are what I call buffalo soldiers. And Sir Lyndon had a very interesting observation to make in 1998. After having been Prime Minister and leader of our party, he said, talking about constitutional reform, and I quote, "Enshrinement of the principles of majority rule and gender equality in a constitutional provision should mean that membership of the Senate and the House of Assembly should reflect as nearly as is reasonably practical the gender balance of the population. And better to enshrine the principle of one man or one person, one vote would require, I suggest, that the voting system for election to the House of Assembly and the appointments system for the Senate be based in the main on proportional representation. In this way, the ultimate composition of the House of Assembly would more accurately reflect the virtual 50-50 balance between voting males and females, as well as the overall pattern of voting in the country," end quote. So we see that the father of the nation recognized from his experience that, as in Guyana, I think Grenada, but certainly in Guyana, where we have a system of proportional representation, we must find a way as parliamentarians to have our parliament better reflect the society in which they are located. And in the opinion of Sir Lyndon, a system of proportional representation would better achieve that. But the political parties themselves must commit to having a quota. We have quota for other things. Why couldn't the parties commit, as is recommended by CEDAW, that there be a quota to reflect? We're not talking simply for symbolism. We're talking about competent, qualified candidates. And the parties ought to commit, because if we're committed to gender equality, it should be reflected in all of the mechanisms which lead to the selection of a candidate. Thirdly, republic. Sir Lyndon recommends that the Bahamas should establish a republic where the head of state is somebody who born here, is a local citizen who can, let me quote him, "I therefore suggest that the Queen of the Bahamas be replaced by a new head of state called the President of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, who would be a citizen of the Bahamas, born in the Bahamas, and permanently resident in the Bahamas. I do not suggest, however, that the President in the new Constitution be a carbon copy of the Governor General in our existing Constitution. The President might be elected for a term of, say, 7 years by an overall majority of the members of each House, and I think the President could and should play a more strategic national role." The other, fourth, the Senate. Currently, the 16 members of our Senate are appointed by the majority of whom by the Prime Minister, then the leader of the opposition, and both of them in consultation. Sir Lyndon suggests that the Senate be reconfigured, and I quote, "I would suggest that 14 of the 16 senators be appointed by the President on the advice of the leaders of the political parties, with numbers in the House of Assembly roughly in proportion to the percentage of number of votes each party won in a general election, and the remaining 2 senators be appointed by the President, acting in his or her own deliberate judgment to represent religious, social, economic interests or such other interests as the President in his or her judgment think." Similarly, interestingly, the Constitutional Review of 2013 also recommended that the composition of the Senate be expanded, and that the independent senators should be chosen to represent religious, economic, social, geographic, and such other interests. So we see that these constructs, executive, legislative, and judiciary, are living institutions and organs of the state. And we as a sovereign peoples and region should really see how we can make them more responsive to us and better reflect our aspirations. Reflection on our practice is critical for us to envision a future that is more sustainable as we are dealing with the existential threat of global warming and rising sea level. It is also essential that we become more nimble as the global the global governance system, that is the Bretton Woods system, are themselves being refigured since 60% of the GDP has left the West, notwithstanding all of the rhetoric and saber rattling. 60% of the global GDP is in the West, Asia and Africa. So clearly at some point, the global governance system will have to reflect the economic power distribution of our countries. And finally, and in conclusion, our people struggled after 400 years of slavery and this long period of colonial control and white merchant domination within the Bahamas. It is a commitment to future generation of Caribbean people that we should design a legislative process that draws on the best, that reflects the people of our society, and that holds the executive accountable and respect the citizens of the country by not abusing our privilege. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister Sayers, for a very comprehensive and rich presentation indeed. I now welcome Honorable Speaker Miller to give his presentation.
Madam Moderator, thanks for that wonderful introduction. I hope the people from Cayman have taped it so I can use it. Bear with me because our Parliament has just taken a decision to go paperless. So I'm trying to honor that tradition by using this computer. We actually gave each elected parliamentarian the day they were sworn in a computer to use. So as Speaker, I guess I have to set an example. So if I get confused here, just give me time, I'll figure it out. Because I'm from a generation in Cayman that was raised without telephones and lamplight, you know, the kerosene lamp. I live in the country. But I endorse everything that my friend, the Speaker, has said before. And I will try to bring what I believe is, I'm kind of known in Cayman for my practical approaches to things. So most of us here, if not all of us, accept the overriding principles of the Westminster-style democracy, the doctrine of separation of powers, namely the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive arm. The legislative branch to make laws, the judiciary to interpret and enforce the laws, and the executive arm to implement the laws, as well as develop policies to enhance the implementation of the laws, which policies may often lead to laws where appropriate. One of the great myths of politicians is that the legislative branch, Parliament, is supreme. And we often justify that logic that Parliament enables the Cabinet and funds the judiciary. We know that is so. Everybody supports us to have an independent Parliament until we actually say we are going to do it. And while by deference, by tradition, all of us as parliamentarians have allowed the judiciary, in particular, to retain and maintain their stellar independence from Parliament. And we are often told by the executive that we politicians should not be involved in appointments in civil service, so they extract their independence in one way. But when we raise the idea of Parliament being independent, it's like mating elephants. It's done at high altitude with a lot of screaming and hollering, and takes a long time to see results. Why? Part of it is because we as parliamentarians often, because we, particularly in the political arena, because we believe that somehow the Westminster system makes us adversarial, we have difficulty in sitting down in a room and agreeing how to do something that benefits everybody. Yes. I happen to have been in Parliament in 2020 as an independent member when we were actually drafting our legislation to make Cayman Islands Parliament independent. And I was an independent candidate, so I was able to play a very, sometimes disruptive role, but most often getting people to come together to achieve what we were trying to achieve. As parliamentarians, a more noble position for us to take is that we're three equal branches of government, but each should have the necessary levels of independence while recognizing that all three branches are codependent. Most of us here today have a similar history in the development of our parliaments. And diverse to say, he mentioned the Bahamian experience. The Cayman experience is rather different. I was born and grew up in Cayman until 1962, when the Cayman Islands was a dependency of Jamaica. When Jamaica went independent, the Cayman Islands decided, when most countries in the Caribbean were running away from the colonial powers, we decided, and what we believe was an informed decision at the time, to become a colony of Great Britain, as opposed to seeking self-governance or independence for itself at the time. And if we look at the growth in the country and the benefit to the people, I think most people will agree today that that was a wise decision at the time. I am one of those who believes it's time to revisit that decision. But that's probably why I'm not elected today. In our parliament, through the colonial system, the governor sat in parliament as the presiding officer. He had his 3 senior civil servants to vote whatever way he wanted them to vote. And oftentimes, many of the exco, we would call at that time, some of them were even appointed by the governor. Until we moved on, and we moved out the first thing was we moved the governor out of parliament and brought in a speaker. And then we moved forward to having ministers, having a proper cabinet, etc., etc. Then in 2020, as I said earlier, we enacted specific legislation to separate the parliament from the civil service, or the executive branch. And it was interesting to sit there in a room and hear the senior civil servants talk about how they supported an independent parliament. But they wanted to hold on to everything that gave them authority over the parliament. The staff had to be civil servants. The finance department had to retain control of the finances, etc., etc. And it was, like I said, it was an interesting experience. But we won out in many of the areas. And our parliament, to a large extent now, is independent from the civil service. The 2 civil servants who sit in parliament, the head of the civil service, and the attorney general no longer have a vote in parliament. So the cabinet really runs the country. And Speaker talked about the authority or the role of cabinet in that, because of how most of our parliaments are structured, the governing party, usually that makes up the cabinet, usually has enough votes, and most of the people are either ministers or parliamentary secretaries, we call them. So it's very difficult to get a vote against whatever the government brings. But you know, Parliament is the only control over a runaway executive. The only thing in the country that can stop a runaway executive is Parliament. And one of the things that I find that as parliamentarians, we tend to give up is we don't utilize the authority that we have and the scrutiny that we can place on cabinet because we don't utilize the facilities we have in Parliament, like the Public Accounts Committee. The Public Accounts Committee, if it functions according to the Constitution and according to the law, is a very powerful committee. But oftentimes, the Public Accounts Committee doesn't meet, doesn't really hold the government to question. It's not that many Cayman Islands because I happen to be chairman for 6 years and I introduce public hearings and all that sort of stuff. And our Public Accounts Committee is up to date. We had a public hearing last week and they were dealing with a report by the Auditor General in February this year. When I attend conferences in relation to Public Accounts Committee, or even conferences like it, you find that some countries are 5, 6 years behind in their public accounting reports. Right? And that's not a good situation to be in. The development of the legislation to separate Parliament can be contentious inside Parliament itself, and we often find that politicians tend to look for what advantage they can get, you know? And instead of accepting the fact that we are here for the common good, and once we get elected, we should be much more collaborative. My short 5-minute speech when I was sworn in as Speaker, I used the word advocational, making the point that we can advocate without being adversarial. Yes. I had one MP come up to me and tell me that I pronounced the word wrong and I spelled it wrong because I meant to say adversarial. But it is unfortunate that under the Westminster system of government, we believe that for us to succeed as politicians, particularly against a government, we have to make the government look bad. And I believe it's time for us to take a more noble approach and realize that when we degrade the government, we are oftentimes eroding the respect that we expect the community to have for Parliament. And again, we allow the executive at times to make subtle changes in legislation which usurps the powers of Parliament. When I first served between 84 and 92, once Parliament passed legislation and the governor signed what we used to call the vellum copy, the law came into effect. We have since graduated to where the cabinet now puts a subtle little clause in law legislation that says to be enacted by order in council. So they usurp the authority of Parliament to actually make the law, because we have done everything with the law, except it can't be enacted until the cabinet decides by notice, by public notice, by order. And they even allow themselves to bring different sections of the law in as it suits them and their influencers to do things in the community. Those are the kind of things that I believe we need to take back to Parliament. In the last several years in Cayman, in fact, I believe that we have so eroded the authority of Parliament by Cabinet making all the decisions in Cabinet, in secret. And part of that is because their logic explanation to me was, well, you know, we don't have to get public scrutiny. If we come down to Parliament, the opposition can comment on it, and the people will know. But we have to recognize that Parliament is the house of the people. That is where the business of the people should be done, not in some boardroom in the government administration building. But I believe that if we are going to get effective legislation to separate Parliament, there's a couple of key things that we need to establish in the legislation. We have to establish a Parliamentary Management Commission. We have to deal with the financial matters for Parliament, some general position and salaries and benefits for both staff. So let's look at these areas. The Parliamentary Commission, this should be the board that manages the operations of Parliament by establishing rules and procedures for the daily operation of Parliament. The Speaker should be the chairperson and have members from both the government and opposition. And one of the things that I have run into as a new Speaker is that the opposition and the government confuse their roles. They have not accepted, well, they have now, because of my rule, but that they are not there as opposition and government. They are there as members of the Parliamentary Management Commission, whose duty and function it is to run the Parliament. The opposition can't be demanding that because people are on the bench that sit in cabinet, that those ministers make decisions about the parliamentary contents and that board. That's not what it's about. It's about the board making the decisions, and then if they need funding or whatever, referring it to the executive for support. So the structure of the commission is important. The functions of the commission needs to be defined in the legislation. Who is the chief operating officer for the daily management of the activities of Parliament? How often the commission meets? Financial matters. This is one of the most significant elements of the separation of Parliament, and the law must clearly define how the Parliament is funded. I must tell you that this is one of the things that we failed at, because the Financial Secretary and the Civil Service argued against me successfully that the finance matters should remain within the executive branch and we must submit a budget like every other department in government, etc., etc. But we need to get past that. We need to amend the law to say that once the Parliament Management Commission agrees on the budget, that's the budget for Parliament. And that should not be subject to the toing and froing that goes on with other departments in government. And it should not be on a line item basis. The total should be funded by 2 annual grants, one in January and one in July. And the Parliament manages its finances. Because if you're not in control of your finances, you're really not independent. Some of the general matters that legislation should address include grievance procedures for both staff and members of Parliament. And this can be very touchy. In our law, we allow the staff of the Parliament to appeal to the Civil Service Tribunal in areas of dispute, instead of setting up a complete new tribunal. One of the contentious things is, how do we discipline members of Parliament? Right? And whether that is done by some kind of selective commission of Parliament. But that in itself lends itself to somebody in Parliament being judge, jury, and hangman. So I have proposed to the Commission that we advocate to have, we have what's called a Standards in Public Life Act. And that has a facility for it to investigate complaints about corruption and all that sorts of stuff of civil servants. So I'm trying to convince the government to let's amend the parliamentary law to say that that is the body which will arbitrate when complaints are made about politicians, to give it some kind of independence. And I believe I will have some success to that in the end. Because the proposal before I got there was that politicians would sign a code of conduct. And if 2 politicians don't sign it, what does that mean? Does that mean the whole code of conduct is out the window? So I'm telling them, let's put it in the law as a schedule. There's no signature required. You must obey the law. One of the things that needs to be addressed in the legislation is how do we go about amending the legislation? Once the Commission decides that something needs to be done, how is that to be piloted through the House? Who's responsible for it? Is it something that we then appeal to the Premier as the lead of government business to sponsor through Parliament? Somebody has to be, and the Speaker can't do it. So, I'm not one of those speakers who believe I should be involved in debates. We have also included in our Parliamentary Act schedules that include salaries for parliamentarians, ministers, speakers, Premier, and everybody else. And the reason we put it in like that, we linked it to civil service salary scales, which are already existing and accepted. But it does not require parliamentarians to raise the specter independently of increasing their own wages. Whenever we give an increase, as we did earlier this year, to the civil service, the parliamentarians benefit because they are in the scale, right? And included in the management of that scale is the fact that when you're first elected as a parliamentarian, you go into what is known in our society, in our place as Schedule D. You start at the bottom. For every 4 years, you get 1 increment, because I think it's a pretty good performance report if your constituency re-elects you, right? The leader of the opposition is in Schedule C, ministers are in B, and the Premier is in A, as is the top civil servant. I'm one of those who does not believe that the top civil servant should be making more pay than the Premier of the country. But that's how we address because increasing salaries for parliamentarians by parliamentarians themselves is difficult to get done, because the opposition sees it as an opportunity to criticize the government because they want it, right? And the government is reluctant to bring it because they know the opposition is going to try to play politics with it and say you're only here for the money. So I believe that isolating it like that and making it a schedule to the law offers a certain amount of protection. As I said earlier, we passed our legislation in 2020, and we made amendments in 21, and we now have a revised Act of 2023. There are still some areas with the experience of time and its implementation that need to be addressed through amendments and additional regulations. However, I believe it is fair to say the Act has enabled the independence of Parliament and improved its function, and I would advise those who have not passed enabling legislation to separate Parliament to give it serious and favourable consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. A very practical and highly relatable presentation. I think that we can all find some moments in there, moments of truth, definitely some very thought-provoking moments. So I would like to try and bring us back on time. We had 2 excellent presentations, and we see that the separation of powers is more than theory. It's the foundation of democracy. We have heard about a myriad of items that make up what is at the heart of this separation of powers. Our speakers both mentioned women's representation. I think Minister Sayers called us Buffalo Soldiers. On gender equality and representation, we have heard parts of the presentation speak on the institutional independence and reform, on parliamentary privilege and constitutional limits. There, Minister Sayers, you touched on republicanism and national identity, on oversight and accountability, which are, of course, critical, and on the balance of power. And then we heard Speaker Miller speak about financial independence. There's absolutely, the key to autonomy is always fiscal, and that fiscal structure, and I sit as a member of our inaugural Parliamentary Services Commission, and yes, the fiscal management as a line item for the funding of Parliament is one that, we still feel challenged with, even though we say we have autonomy. That's the area we don't feel that autonomy exists. And if any autonomy is to come, it's to come through the finances. On the parliamentary management, Speaker Miller spoke about how we act in nonpartisan ways, when we sit on this commission, how we remove ourselves from our roles as opposition and government. How do we function in that way? And definitely on accountability and standards. With all of this said, and with all of these diverse experiences, and yet some similarities in the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands, through your presentations, we want to first of all thank you both for very rich, very enlightening presentations. I would like to, though, take the time to open the floor for your questions, for your comments, and even if you have some shared experiences as you've listened to the presentations that you would like to present this afternoon. The floor is now open to you colleagues for any questions, comments, or shared experiences.
If I might, through you, Madam Chair. Madam Moderator, if I might, through you, Rochelle Ford, Speaker of the House of Assembly in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
We can hardly hear you, Madam Speaker.
Can't not hear the Speaker.
There you
That's
go.
unacceptable.
Now you sound like a speaker.
Yes, Rochelle Ford, Speaker of the House of Assembly, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I just want to first, as you have done, Madam Moderator, congratulate both presenters for a very enriching and thought-provoking presentation. I actually think that they are both worthy of publication as historical documents eventually and guiding documents for immediate purposes. And so I thank you very much. There are lots of questions that I can pose, but it really is one to the Honorable Alfred Sears, Honorable Minister. You spoke very clearly, and we hear it all the time, and just for purposes of completeness, I am the chairman of the CWP, so this would not be lost on me, and it has been something that has troubled me for eons, and it's about quotas. I commend you, I celebrate you, and I stand with you for recognizing that you stand on the shoulders of your Buffalo soldiers. Your Buffalo generals is what I'd probably prefer, but thank you nonetheless. And it is indeed factual throughout the Caribbean. I've heard it all week, I've heard it for years, that the women are among the driving forces, but the proportionate or representation is not there. I think that is established. But that conversation needs to go one step further respectfully, and it is in this regard. It would be fantastic to see put in writing through the political parties' manifestos or their guiding principles, the idea of the quota. I agree 100%. However, given the current climate of what politics looks like, and I can speak specifically to Caribbean politics, how do we attract the women to enter into that arena? Let me make sure that I keep my language very sanitized. You know, I admire and commend all the women here who've put themselves up for, to be elected and representatives and that sort of thing, because that is not an easy task. And as we all agree, especially on the idea of quotas, and of course, my proportion might be slightly different to some others. How do we attract the, as you said, the competent candidates, competent qualified candidates? Because those are the people, I can tell you, certainly in my little jurisdiction, who run furthest away from it because of the mudslinging that holds. So when we talk about that, it has to be with an understanding that the climate itself needs to be changed, and that narrative has to be changed by those who currently constitute those offices. We have to make a concerted effort, in my small, considered opinion, to change the narrative if we want to attract the quality and the competence. There are lots of competent young people, lots and lots of competent young women, but they deliberately stay away because of what politics looks like. And I think that is a conversation that we need to have, and take it more than just a conversation, but put it into action by deliberate and demonstrative ways to end that dirtiness of political life. So that is my comment. Thank you.
Do we have any other commentary? I would like to piggyback off of that, Madam Speaker. Apart from I definitely agreeing with your comment about enriching presentations and worthy of publication, which we'll speak to both panelists about after. As Minister Stairs spoke about in 1973, when the Bahamas negotiated our independence, and not one woman was in that delegation. And I think we can all, as female parliamentarians, look around our parliaments and remember when there was probably only one woman that was represented, if any. And despite women having already won that right to vote and played critical roles in the journey, they were absent. So the question is, and I think we've been asking this for the past 2 days when we met in our women's caucus, how do we confront this historical exclusion? What more has to be done to ensure that there is full and equal participation by women in political leadership? But most importantly, how do we confront the issue of the fair? Because the fair comes in the fact that women have the desire, women can see themselves in places of national service. But when we look at, as you call it, and we're Caribbean people in here, you say the dirtiness. And that is something that as women in Parliament we speak about, and as we mentor other young women, that's the one resounding, consistent fear of women entering, and that one barrier. How are colleagues such as our male counterparts able to even assist us in that way in attracting more in terms of inclusion for female parliamentarians?
Hello, Vance Campbell from Bermuda.
Go ahead, sir.
Both presenters put forth some great points. The question is, there are many jurisdictions where once cabinet is selected, cabinet ends up being the majority. And how do you suggest the independence is maintained when the possibility exists that you cannot even select an oversight committee without including members of the cabinet? So you're asking them to look into their own work. So like I said, there are a lot of great suggestions, but what about in those jurisdictions where once the cabinet is selected, cabinet equals the majority of the members of the House of Assembly? Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for both questions and observation. On the question of better gender representation or parity within our system, I think historically the men have set a perception and a tenor in the conduct of politics. Politics is seen as a combat over spoils. There's a very heavy tradition, as you know, within our region of patronage politics. And it's even in Parliament, there is a kind of I gotcha, it's really to embarrass and to, and because of the qualified privilege, some of the most irresponsible allegations are made with a lot of damage, especially to people's families and so on, or members' families. I think that we have to redefine what politics is. I mean, politics, as I see it, is a process of determining how to use the common goods of our society. These goods don't belong to my party. They don't belong to any party. They belong to the state. And every member of that community, of that society, has the right to have access because the goods are common goods. I think we have a tradition that, where almost like you capture the state for a party, and you use the common goods as if they belong to a party and the supporters of the party. And I think we all, this involves all of us. We have to redefine what the politics is. If we see them, treat them as common goods, then we know that everybody has an entitlement. The other point is that the parties have a responsibility, because even though they are not constitutional organs, and they are not even regulated in many of our countries in terms of the democratic practice within the party is the organ that is organized and through which the members are elected and comprise either the minority or the majority, and by being the majority, you have essentially control of the state. The parties have to commit to equality, and not just because you are the leader's friend. You have to befriend the leader, and then you ride with the leader. Is that they're, just like we would do it with our business, rational, proper structure, and the parties have to take the responsibility and have to, we not just in terms of rhetoric with respect to gender equality, but also in terms of the party's constitution and the party's practices. The third thing is that mentoring is so important. We have to create an environment where young women are not perceived as prey, where young women it has to be safe, it has to be nurturing, and we have to mentor. We have daughters. We have to mentor young women in the process, because a lot of the political leaders in our various countries would have come into the party as young people and have been mentored and as they evolve. So we have to have a greater, because all of us are politicians, Well, I mean, you know, whether you're speaker, you're member of parliament, we have to really make a greater commitment to mentoring young people, and especially young women, and as colleagues who we will take the responsibility to providing opportunity. So the culture, the definition of politics, what it means, the commitment by the party, and each of us has to take the responsibility of mentoring young men and women. And it will force us when we come together, because you know there's a certain kind of culture. And in that culture, there's a lot of sexism. We will have to correct ourselves and grow as men to be respectful and to be affirming of women, not, I mean, as colleagues, pure and simple. On the issue of the cabinet almost constituting half or more of the parliament, I mean, clearly, there was a time in all of our countries when our cabinet was half the size it is today. And there is a political stratagem which is at play in terms of maintaining a certain level of influence. And I think that this is why the Republican form of government is so critical, because if you have an executive president can bring the best talent that is available into the cabinet. And the legislature could be focused on lawmaking and representation. And I believe with a Republican form of government, the people in our countries would get a much more attentive members of parliament, because that will be the primary job, because straddling the executive and the parliamentary, I think leads to parties, electorate switching, and the change of government is more frequent because the electorate is acting really against as opposed to what they want to affirm. It's like, you know, let me teach you a lesson. If you think you're so big and important and so on. So I think that we have to reflect as parliamentarians on how do we restructure, reorder, and reform so that better representation, holding the executive accountable, and also the executive having a wider pool of talent to draw from than the small number of persons in the parliament.
I would just like to add that I think there's a huge shift that needs to be made in Parliament. I think we have to get away from the culture of, as I said earlier, I have to make you look bad so that I look good. Why can't we develop a culture that says the government brings a piece of legislation, for instance, say it's an education law, rather than the opposition just getting up and criticizing the government of how bad the law is? Imagine if the opposition took a more positive approach and pointed out some of the difficulties with the legislation, but filed amendments to correct it, to make it a better law. Isn't it easier to go out and campaign that, yes, the government brought an education law, but I, as a member of the opposition, made it better because I filed 20 amendments to a closed bill, and the 20 amendments were successful. But the attitude now is it's adversarial, and this is just a bad government, this is just a bad education law, and we can't defeat it, So the good parts of it we'll get and then leave it alone. And it's the same thing I believe we want to get more women involved. We have to be more positive and more accommodating to women and promoting their expertise in Parliament and give them an opportunity to develop and shine as parliamentarians.
Madam Chair, like those who preceded me, I want to thank the two panelists for their presentations. Sadly, though, I'm a politician rooted in reality. So, to my Bermudan counterpart, who made a great point about this, the
Mr.
size of the
Speaker, we
cabinet
can
and the
hardly
elected
hear you.
members. To my Bermudan counterpart who made the point about the size of the cabinet, the reality is, because of our small size, most parliaments in the Caribbean are 20, 30. So even if you have a 15-member opposition, it is always going to be the case that the majority are going to be cabinet members. That's the reality of our small size. You know? And even when there is a larger size, it doesn't always work. We go back to the mother country. People look at England as this great democracy and tend to forget Oliver Cromwell killed the king and was a dictator for 6 years. We tend to forget that. We speak about, to follow up with my sister Rochelle, on the women. In Grenada 7 years ago, there was a referendum to make women equal to men in everything, salaries, everything. Grenada has 52% women and 48% men. The referendum was defeated 73% to 27%. You try and figure that out. And my good friend, Minister Searle, spoke about executive presidency. What exactly do you think Guyana is? Thank you.
You know, when we talk about patriarchy and the stereotype based on gender, you have to recall that we have hundreds of years of conditioning, both men and women. Both men and women. And this is why political education is important, and the political parties who commit to presenting themselves for election to govern not just men, but to govern everybody in the interests of everybody, has a very special duty to address some of the historic legacies. And these are legacies, because very seldom do we step aside and critically look in the mirror at ourselves, because the whole concept of leadership is male and the role of the man as head of the house. In other words, you're talking about an ideology that is constantly reinforced in the community, in the church, and from different platforms. So I'm not surprised that the referendum would have gotten the result that it did. That is why political education is so important. We re-educate ourselves. We were all in this room educated by chalk and talk when we went to school. The speaker today demonstrated to us that even though he was educated by chalk and talk, we saw the speaker using his computer. In other words, we have to be, if we are committed to lifelong learning in order to do our work in the House of Assembly or the Parliament, clearly the ideas that we have inherited about gender and who is the best leader, clearly we need to re-educate ourselves the same way we are learning how to use technology. Do I want my daughters, really, in whom I have put my savings, just about all of my savings, in educating them, right? I mean, am I to tell them that they're not worthy of doing what I've done and also beyond what I have done? I think it would be an absurdity. So we have to assume the responsibility, Mr. Speaker. We have to assume that responsibility to critically analyze what we have received and how do we maximize the human resource in our country. If we say only this demographic is capable, then the bulk of the community are women. And also, I think we have to look within our homes and see that the people who manage better, the people who can collaborate, who can resolve disputes without getting a machete. And so I think it's an opportunity for us. Because when you go into referendum, oftentimes the referendum is capitalized by the opposition party and is often utilized as a means to mobilize opposition against the party in government. So we can assume and should the responsibility as parties and as individuals. I support reparation because I'm a lawyer and in the eyes of some people, but my ancestors, I am the product of people who have survived. The fact that I'm in a setting, should that make me embarrassed to claim my ancestors when the persons who owned slaves got reparation and the British borrowed money? They just completed paying off those bonds a few years ago. In other words, we from this region have a history, and we have to affirmatively address the legacies that are holding us back. And this is what I see as an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, for us to really lead in a much more enlightened manner so that we give everybody in our country the freedom to fly.
I would just add that in Cayman, for instance, I grew up in a very matriarchal society. In the Cayman Islands from 1946 to 1965, all the men went to sea. So the women ran everything. So the churches, the government, the businesses, the offices, the families, everything. So I probably have an unusual respect and relationship with women that most politicians would not have. But I certainly recognize their capacity. And I think if we can change Parliament from being so adversarial to something that is much more collaborative, I think we will find that women will gravitate towards that environment more so than coming into a hostile environment where men are just at each other's throat every time Parliament meets.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Do we have any more comments from the floor?
I have a question. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to the panel. You did an exceptional job. Perlina McGaw, Lumsden, Deputy Speaker of the Cayman Islands. I do have two questions, but I know everybody's tired, so I'll actually pose one question. How best does the panel, or anyone actually that's here, see the best way of the opposition obtaining resources in order to fulfill their role or to carry out the responsibilities that's assigned to them?
I think you need to repeat the question.
Can you repeat the question? Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. How best does Parliament actually see the leader of the opposition or the office of the opposition obtaining resources to carry out their role and duty to the public?
I think this campaign finance is one of the key areas in urgent need of reform throughout our region. We know that access to money and funding is easier when you're in government, well, in some circumstances, but we also live in societies where the merchant elites have a relationship, or the industrial elite in other places have a relationship with a particular political party, and they may be well-funded as a result of those historic ties, and other political organizations which do not have that relationship and which is in opposition, but has a great platform, a very committed cadre of persons, and also represent a constituency within the country that needs to be heard and or have a platform that can solve the national problems. And I personally believe that there should be a system of campaign financing by the state, because you will make the funding more transparent and also avoid undue influence on the governance of the country.
Thank you. I'll open for one more question or comment.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sharon Simons, a Member of Parliament from the Turks and Caicos. I am a new parliamentarian. I've gone through the election we had an election in February. And as a young woman, a single mother, entering into politics in the Turks and Caicos, that was a task for me. It is not a safe place for young women to be. And it's important that we talk about mentorship, that we, as women, mentor young girls about the political arena in order for them to be interested in getting involved in politics, because it's really not a safe place. However, I was determined that that wasn't going to deter me, because I have a goal to help the people of the country and to offer my service. And I had decided that that is what I wanted to do. So I think it's important that mentorship programs are put in place for young girls and young women so that they can be able to offer their services and give back to their country and in politics. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Catherine?
Thank you. I just had a quick question to Honorable Alfred Spears, you made a comment. You made a comment earlier. Actually, it was a quote from the lady McDo. Constitution should be a living document, and I was just curious. This question isn't directly posed to the panelist, but I know in the Cayman Islands, our constitutional reform does not happen very frequently, and I was just curious if there's anyone around the room that has like a mechanism in place for frequent constitutional reviews, or is this just something that members decide that they want to champion?
Yeah, I would say briefly that the oldest constitution in this region is the United States. And at the time the United States Constitution was adopted, that would have been, 1760 something. You still had slavery in the United States. So we know that this Constitution began in a very treacherous environment. Slavery was abolished in the U.S., 1864? At the same time, the 13th Amendment was enacted, which recognized that those persons who were formerly in bondage or in slavery would become citizens. The United States has amended its constitution 27 times. In other words, a constitution, we have to appreciate that a constitution is a construct. It's the constitutive law, but it reflects a certain moment in time. And Maris McDougall talks about a constitution as a social process, that it is living. We see our constitution as being fixed, right? And sometimes it's the distrust of politicians that leads to the failure of a referendum. So therefore, it is important that there be continuous education. Education is critical. And just like we apply ourselves to learn new technology, we have to apply ourselves in the social governance structure of our country. And yes, difficult, but necessary.
I just have a quick comment before you make the comment. I'm Gordon Burton, Speaker, Turks and Caicos. We recently had changes to our Constitution in November of last year. This is 2024. However, the discussions about those changes started between the 2012 to 2016 administration, the 2016 to 2021 administration, and the 2021 to the 2024 administration. So the discussions were ongoing because as you all know, we are part of the UK, we are an overseas territory, and many of the proposals that were put forward were not accepted by the UK. And so it took all of that time to finally convince the UK to agree to just some of the recommendations that were made.
I think that's very instructive because we are so accustomed to having our referendum is for a year, 2 years, you have discussion. And then if the referendum is not successful, it kind of peters out. But in the United States, each of those referendum, they would have been going on 20, 30 years. There was a constant discussion, dialogue within the society as you did in Turks and Caicos. So we have to, this engagement has to be a more sustainable engagement and not simply around, it's just a transaction. And if it doesn't happen, let me move on to the next. I think that we have to commit to this governance and its democratic process as a lifetime commitment. And sometimes the things we advocate for may not come about in our lifetime, but we know that they will benefit our children and those who ain't born yet. And I think that that kind of commitment to governance and the vision of what is the best practice, especially for the welfare of our people, it has to be a long-term commitment.
And there should be a constant evaluation of your constitution. Because if the constitution is supposed to be the overriding law, the constitution needs to be adjusted, not in a fixed periodical time, but it should be adjusted in order to accommodate the changes in the society and the changes in governance structure that we want to put in. I started advocating in Cayman in 1972 as a young university student for one man, one vote. I didn't get it until, I think it was in 2016, right? Right? Yeah. But you have to have, and it is, the problem with the overseas territories constitutions is they are not our constitutions. That is simply an operational manual, like when you go to Home Depot and you buy a lawnmower and you get an operational manual coming in. That's the operational manual by which the United Kingdom government intends to operate the country, right? And there are serious confines. But I will tell you, my personal experience in dealing with the UK, up until 1992, every thrown speech by a governor advocated for constitutional advancement in Cayman, but it was a choice of the people. We went through the process, brought in constitutional commissioners in 1992, drafted a whole new constitution. The politicians started to take advantage and see how they could benefit by opposing the constitution, so much so that the constitution was rejected in a referendum. Then the attitude of the British government changed. That is when we got the white paper, and they now try to tell us what they are going to do to us because we are not doing enough for ourselves. And invariably, in the Cayman experience, it is the local politicians who have gone against advancement, and it's usually led by the opposition, whoever that happens to be at the time, because constitutional change in Cayman is really a bad word, you know? And they see great political mileage. I mean, we had, in 2009, we had the unfortunate situation where the leader of the opposition actually went to the UK and negotiated a constitution, right? And then came back to Cayman and launched a campaign against it, right? And that kind of disrespect for our own ability in front of the administrative public of the UK is a no-no. They're going to take advantage of that for the next 25 years. I was part of the group that went to London in 2018, looking for constitutional advancement. And I was the leader of the opposition at the time, and I told the Premier, I will go to London to support constitutional advancement, but you and I are going to sit down and we are going to decide what we are going to seek before we go there. Because I'm not going there and you springing the surprises on me, or I'm not going to spring the surprises on you, right? And we went and we got, I was amazed at how willing the United Kingdom government at the administrative power was willing to reduce, because we almost went to where Bermuda is, right? In terms of them not being able to make legislation for us and all that sort of stuff. But again, we got the politicians involved in the next election campaigning about the changes that we had made. We're trying to get to the Constitution. And it so happened that the British government withdrew the biggest change that we had in place, where the governor couldn't write legislation, right? So it is the local politicians, and it gets back to that adversariality that we believe we have to get a got-you situation, or we have to find a way to embarrass whichever party is in government in order for us to gain. My grandmother always told me, you get more flies with honey than vinegar, you know.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to both of our panelists. And to capture what you both just concluded with, the constitutional advancement requires a consistent advocacy, consistent dialogue. And that is where we come to the place of the separation of powers, in fact, and how we have independent parliaments, which are ensuring that our citizens' voices are not only respected, and especially ladies, women in parliament, no matter our gender. But our task is not only to protect that independence of our parliaments, but to adapt it for today's challenges, which have emerged as we had our conversations today. I will agree with the honorable member from Turks and Caicos who speaks to mentorship and support. Passion for national service has to exceed fear, but generally fear is removed through that mentorship to support the undergirdment. So the continued dialogue, the continued advocacy, as we leave this very enriching session that took place today, this afternoon, we have much to reflect on. I ask in a call to action that we recommit to strengthening parliaments as credible, trusted, more positive, less adversarial, equitable, and independent institutions across our Commonwealth. I want to thank our panelists and congratulate them again. I want to ask you to give them a round of applause for the wealth of knowledge that they have imparted to us today. And I've been asked to do a little bit of housekeeping in that to remind you that there is a reception tonight at 7:30 in the Compass Rose Ballroom at the Margaritaville Resort. We look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your evening as we see you at our reception this evening.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, ma'am.
Madam Moderator, thank you.
Very good job, ma'am. Very good.
Yeah, that's what you call being prepared
Yeah.
and well executed.
You made me feel so important. And thank you for I enjoyed the You know, one of the things that I enjoy. Distinguished QC,